just finished doing the 20th Two Johns Sci-Fi podcast. Maybe I should have chilled out a little bit, meditated, because apparently I'm not doing very well with English. But I just finished doing the vigesimal. I'll put that word up when I do post-prod. The 20th Two Johns Sci-Fi podcast. And I was inspired to, for one thing, I want to try to do my microphone. I'm trying to figure out why my microphone works sometimes and why it doesn't. And so I've plugged it in, and of course, if it works, then you'll see this. If you don't see this, then it didn't work. But I have no subject. I have no subject for this particular podcast. And the reason is because this podcast is simply inspired by the desire to do a podcast based on the energy of the previous podcast. Now, if you've watched episode 20 of the Two Johns Sci-Fi podcast, you know that things did not go well at the beginning. We had done setup 2 hours before, where we went through Facebook and we went through Instagram, and everything worked perfectly. And yet when we tried to do it again, Instagram kept giving it. They wouldn't let me log in to the podcast. They wouldn't let John turn down his volume all the way, so we kept getting an echo effect. It was very, very problematic. I don't know how we can fix that. The technology is one of those things that you plug in and you take your chances. And in this case, again, it worked perfectly. It worked perfectly. We always do a test before the podcast. I mean, you guys see the podcast, but we always do a test before the podcast to try to make sure that the connections are working. For some reason, it worked perfectly during the setup, and then it did not work when we actually tried to do things. It's very frustrating. So the people on Instagram kind of got robbed. Although there are ways to post videos after the effect on Instagram, and we'll probably try to do that. Now, the reason that I'm talking about a completely different podcast on this podcast is because there are two podcasts. And I've had a lot of discussions with people, with some friends of mine, about that podcast and this podcast, and the differences between the two. For example, on the Two Johns Sci-Fi podcast, because it's a sci-fi podcast, I talk a lot about science. I talk about a lot about hard science, physics and astronomy and neurology and biology and cybernetics, AI, robotics, things like that. Things that are geared toward the sort of hard science, sci-fi stuff that is what John Austin's magazine, Fresh Pulp, is focused upon. And that's good, because I love that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of sci-fi that I like. And John and I have similar complaints about what's happened to sci-fi, which is that a long time ago, science fiction writers would read a lot of science, and they would try to find ways to incorporate that science into a story. And in the process of writing that story, messages would appear. And that's a good thing, because it's important to have a positive impact on your readers through your stories. So you'd have messages that were just built in, things that as you're exploring the implications of different science and technological effects on the way that people interact with each other, you learn things about people. And these sorts of messages would get into the stories. What has unfortunately happened, I believe, and I think John agrees with me on this, in sci-fi, is that sci-fi readers are doing a lot less reading of actual science. And they're just reading other science fiction. Or they're sort of gathering, science fiction is so popular these days, they're just sort of gathering this sort of popular conception of what sci-fi is. And they're trying to build messages into the story artificially. Now, as I said before, I don't want to make this sound like I'm criticizing in some like some sad puppy's way. I'm just criticizing the idea of putting messages into sci-fi stories. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, and what I think John is saying, is that the sci-fi has to be about putting the science fiction into a story about people, and the message will emerge. If you start with the message and you sort of tack on the science in order to make the message work, you're working backward, and you're not going to be as effective in getting the message across, precisely because the people who are not going to want to hear that message are going to veer off, and they're going to not listen. If you put the science first and the message emerges organically from that, the way that it did in classic sci-fi, people become engaged with the science in the story and how the science affects the way people interact, and the message just kind of lightly sets itself on their brain. And because the science story was so engaging, it doesn't go away. That to me is how effective. That's why classic sci-fi stories were so effective in getting into the public consciousness. Precisely because the science came first and the message evolved out of that. And I think we've lost that in sci-fi. And of course, the proper reaction to that is not to trash the idea of messages being in genre fiction. You can't avoid messages; it's just unavoidable. But the messages shouldn't be that shouldn't be your starting off point. Your primary interest as a sci-fi writer should be science, and then you see a science story and you think, how could I put this into a story? Or you see a science article, some research paper, something that someone has discovered, and you think, how can I put this into a story where it engages, because stories have to be about people, where this science engages people in a different way. And as you're writing that story, a message will come out of it. You didn't decide what the message was, it just came out. And then the message is carried along like a surfer on a wave with the science. That's how it should be. The same way within fantasy. In fantasy is more about, where science is more about the hard subjects. Fantasy is more about it's about mythology and religious studies and anthropology. So when you're looking for a fantasy story, you're looking for something more, psychology and culture and stuff like that, and you find something in there that you think this would make a good story. You write the story about people interacting in this what if people lived in a patrilocal yet matrilineal society? And you write that story, and messages evolve as you're writing. You realize the implications for this anthropological stuff in the lives of the actual human beings in your story, and a message comes out of it. And that message resonates precisely because it's based in the science. So this is something that crosses all genres. I mean, you can even imagine it being in detective fiction and thrillers. You start with the really hardcore basis of what that genre is about. You apply that to human beings interacting, and then you'll find a message that deserves to be shared. And that you don't have to start out trying to signal something. You start out with something that has you're not even looking for a message. You'll find a good message in that. So as far as the two Johns, we focus more on the sci-fi. So we just recently did a science roundup. We were just talking about a series of science discoveries that have popped up in the past few months, and occasionally going into how they would feature in a sci-fi story. And on my podcast, on the Thoughts of Leith podcast, as you may know, I focus more on history and psychology and anthropology, and a lot of my books unboxings are precisely about that sort of subject. And I don't talk too much about how you could build a story, but you can imagine. I mean, a lot of my stories, especially my fantasy stories, sort of plug into this period of colonial interaction between different types of human beings. I mean, the Ends of the World, the Observer series really ties into this, and the Goodly Creatures. That all of that is sort of tied into this same sort of period of history that I'm very focused on. A lot of the books that I read and the unboxings that I've done tie into this, and even stories like the Angel series, which my Kindle book, the On the Head of a Pin, is has a lot of sort of comparative religion going on in it, and literary theory, and the same thing applies there that applies to sci-fi. Is you start with the ideas, and then you apply that to human interactions. You get your story, and then you find the message. You don't start with, if you want to start with the message, you're going at it in the reverse direction. So that's kind of something that I was thinking about a lot of that particular podcast that I had with John. And I didn't want to get into this. We already had decided we were going to do a long. We normally do we normally do either a half hour or an hour. And we had so much material this time that we made a decision to just let it go as long as it, do the Joe Rogan thing, the long form thing. And we went almost 2 hours with this particular podcast. And I liked it. I liked that better. We gave ourselves enough time with each subject to actually thoroughly explore it. But the whole time I was thinking about this particular subject, about the proper order of message and idea in stories, and that's the proper message. It's like the problem with message-oriented fiction is not that there's messages in it. It's not that there's politics in it. It's that the politics came first. And instead, the ideas should come first. The bare facts upon which you base the human interactions of the characters in your story. And then the messages will arise out of that. And they may surprise you. And that's a good thing, being surprised. They may surprise you. They may not. You may see it and you go, oh, I'm writing a story about this thing that I already cared about. That's good too. But the message should arise naturally. Because if the message doesn't arise naturally, if it looks like it was imposed upon your fiction, you're going to have two reactions. You're going to have a group of people who are cheering you on because they already agreed with what you said, and a group of people who hate you because they already disagreed with what you said, and they're just reacting to the message. And you don't want that sort of divisiveness. Is not what you want. But if you start with the ideas, and as you're writing the story, the message organically grows out of those ideas. That other side, the part that is the haters, who are automatically going to, they'll key into the ideas first, and those ideas will carry them into the message. You'll be far more effective convincing people of that message than if you start with the message and you impose it upon a set of ideas, impose it upon a genre, impose it upon a story. So this is sort of I guess a middle ground between what is happening in a lot of fiction today and the alt-right reaction to it. There's a third way of looking at this, which understands that the criticisms have a basis, but at the same time, the problem is not that there are messages in fiction. The problem is how the messages arise in fiction. And I think that John would agree with me, although if he doesn't, what we'll do next time, the next time we have a Two Johns episode, we'll debate this. But I think he would agree that it's not about the fact that there are messages in fiction. It's about whether the messages arise organically out of the natural genre components of that of the particular story, or whether the messages are imposed on it and sort of like stamped on it. They shouldn't be stamped on it. They should just grow out of it organically. And that makes the story far more effective, far more convincing, and far more beautiful and artistic, I think. So anyway, that's this episode of Thoughts of Leith, and I thank you for tuning in, share and like, and of course, as always, subscribe for more Thoughts of Leith.